Runaway brides. What's your story? What was the final straw? How last second did you leave? On my birthday, my boyfriend proposed to me at my party, in front of all my family and friends. I said yes, mostly because I felt too embarrassed to say no. We'd been together for 2 years, but I was just about to start university and I wasn't ready for marriage at all. Later, when we were alone, I asked if we could have a long engagement, at least a year or two, and he agreed. We told our families and friends that we would wait to get married. Less than 3 months later, his mom and my mom took me out for lunch and then decided to look at wedding dresses, saying it's never too early to start planning. When I saw a really nice dress that was on sale, my fiance's mom insisted on buying it for me. Their family was quite wealthy, and I'd saved money for all my fiance's important life events, like education, his first car, and the wedding. She said they were happy to cover the big costs because they wanted a big wedding, and joked that I could pay her back with grandchildren. A few weeks later, his mom introduced me to a friend who was a florist. Before I knew it, I was looking at bouquets and talking about table arrangements. Then my fiancé started discussing wedding venues, saying we needed to plan to find the perfect place. I started to panic. I was only a few months into university, still figuring out my education. Now I was choosing venues for a wedding that was supposed to be years away. A wedding that was looking more and more like a grand affair. I tried to talk to my fiancé, but he wouldn't listen. We found a venue we liked, but they had no availability for almost 2 years. So we booked it. I could finally relax, thinking I had 2 years to prepare for my big, crazy wedding. Then the venue had a cancellation less than 6 months away, and my fiancé accepted it without telling me. He just canceled our future date and took the new one that was available. He arranged the entire wedding with the help of his mom and mine, with her overbearing ways, before telling me. When he told me everything was booked, I was furious. He said he had gone with all my choices for catering, venue, flowers, and that I should be grateful that he'd handled all the stressful stuff. All I had to do was show up. When I explained that I didn't want to get married in 6 months and that I had told him several times I wasn't ready for marriage yet, he called me childish and said the invitations were already being printed, so it was too late to change my mind. I finally realized he was manipulating me, so I returned the engagement ring and told him I didn't want to see him anymore. I told my family and friends, cried a lot, and changed my phone number because he wouldn't stop calling. 2 months later, my mom got a call from his mom, who couldn't reach me to arrange dress fittings and finalize the bridesmaids. He hadn't told them we had broken up. My mom explained everything to his mom, thinking that was the end of it. The following week, she had the nerve to send my family a bill for half of what they had spent on the wedding. It was thousands of pounds. They had booked everything, down to the cake and the wedding favors, without telling me, and now they want me to pay? Sounds like he really wanted a trophy wife and not a marriage. Story 2. When I was still in high school, I met a guy who claimed to be in the army. This was before the internet was widely used, so there was no easy way to check if what he said was true. We got along well and I was young and fell in love quickly, so when he proposed, I was very happy. Looking back, there were warning signs. He asked my parents for permission to marry me. He proposed loudly in a pizza shop, which made it socially awkward to say no. He didn't have his own place to live. I never met his family. I never saw any proof that he was actually in the military. A few weeks later, we had an argument because he called out his sister's name during intimate time. He then told me that everything would be okay because he was going to take me to Kentucky to live in an army base. He also said he wanted me to be barefoot and pregnant most of the time, laughing as he said it. We were planning to get married and leave the day after I graduated from high school. I did a lot of thinking about my feelings in the situation. I became quiet and withdrawn. One day while visiting my grandmother, she asked me, "Are you in love with him or are you in love with the idea of a wedding?" Her question made me realize the truth. I cried and ended my relationship with him just 2 weeks before I was supposed to graduate. It turned out he had already made arrangements with the justice of the peace for a wedding, but he got married anyway, just 3 weeks later using the same ring he had given to me. I feel sorry for the girl he married. I wish I could talk to her to warn her about him. Story 3. I had a friend who didn't know she was the bride until she was halfway down the aisle at a wedding. Her parents had arranged a marriage for her, which is common in her culture. They told her that the whole family had been invited to a cousin's wedding. My friend was told that everyone would be wearing white, although I didn't remember the reason for that. They arrived at the church just before the bride was supposed to walk down the aisle. My friend, thinking they were late, wanted to quietly slip in and stay at the back of the church. However, her father took her arm and they started walking up the aisle. It wasn't until they were halfway up the aisle that she stopped and realized everyone was looking at her, smiling and crying tears of joy. She turned to one of her aunts sitting in the pew next to her and asked who was getting married. The whole church went silent, and then the aunt looked at my friend's father and said, "You can't be serious. You planned a wedding for your daughter and just expected her to go along with it? Have the two of them even met? Did you really think this would work?" The room was filled with chatter about them, and the father just cleared his throat and told his daughter to keep walking. Luckily, the aunt grabbed my friend and pulled her into the pew, putting her past the row of people, and they both ran out of the church. After that, her parents disowned her and she moved in with that aunt. It's important to note that they are an Indian family living in the US. Her parents are very traditional, and she has expressed that she didn't want to get married and instead wanted to focus on her career. Story 4. I dated a woman for a short time who was a runaway bride. Her ex-fiancé never hurt her, but he constantly put her down and was emotionally hurtful. He would tell her she was lucky to have him, that she could never find anyone better, that she was unattractive, but he tolerated it, and so on. Despite being intelligent, she had a medic in the military, saving many lives in Pakistan. She fell to his emotional manipulation, which can happen to anyone given enough time. On her wedding day, her father, who hadn't been a big part of her life since divorcing when she was a teenager, was talking to her in the room when she was getting ready. He became concerned when she started repeating some of the negative things her fiancé had said to her. In the middle of her sentence, he stood up and unexpectedly suggested they go to Dairy Queen. When she was younger, they often went to DQ to talk over ice cream. After a moment, she agreed, and they left for Dairy Queen. However, he drove to a town 3 towns over, and they sat and talked for hours over ice cream while her phone rang until the battery drained in the car. She said it felt like a huge burden had been lifted from her shoulders, and although she felt bad that her friends and family were waiting for her at the wedding, she knew they would all understand later. Eventually, her father returned to the church and told the bridal party that the wedding was off. He then got his friends to help him move all her things out the next day. She said that while her dad wasn't the best father during her teenage years, he was the best dad anyone could ask for on that day. We dated for a couple of weeks before we realized we weren't a good match. We parted on good terms, but I haven't spoken to her since. Story 5. My dad was a runaway groom. He broke off his engagement just 3 days before the wedding. It was the mid-1970s and he was in his early 20s. His fiancée, who wasn't my mom, and her mother pressured him into proposing. He did it with my grandmother's ring. He also felt like society expected him to get married. It was more common to marry at a young age back then. Deep down, he knew she wasn't the right person for him, but he thought maybe all men felt that way before getting married, so he ignored his doubts and hoped his feelings would change. Months went by and all the wedding plans were made. When relatives and friends from out of town started flying in for the wedding and gifts started arriving, the reality of the situation got him hard. He realized he had made a big mistake, as God Bluff would say. He sat down with my grandma and grandpa and told them, "I don't want to go through with this." They were proud of him for being honest and were actually a bit thrilled because they didn't like his fiancée at all. But they told him he needed to tell her face-to-face right away. And so my dad did. He won't tell me the details, but he said it was the most difficult conversation, argument, and experience he's ever had. But he ended the engagement. This was the 1970s, so you couldn't just send a text or post on Facebook to tell everyone the wedding was canceled, like a friend of mine did. My dad took the responsibility to call every single invited guest to let them know the wedding was off. Even more, he personally returned the gifts that people had sent. His fiancée sold my grandmother's ring. Story 6. This isn't my story, and I'm not sure if it counts as a runaway situation, but my sister broke up with her fiancé 4 months before their wedding, which was already planned and paid for. To be honest, I don't know the full story. Even now, a year and a half later, she still hasn't fully opened up to us about it. However, I never really liked the guy. He was nice enough, but he couldn't handle his drink at all. He never had just a little drink. He had to drink the whole bar every time. Then he would come home and make a mess all over the house. After that, he had the nerve to complain whenever my sister would go out with her friends for a couple of drinks. He eventually stopped letting her go out altogether. His family was a complete mess too. His mom and stepdad were pretty cool, but they moved to Canada to follow their dreams, leaving my sister and her fiancé in the care of aunts and uncles who didn't approve of her at all. His younger brother was on and off with his teenage girlfriend, who he eventually got pregnant, and she was always trying to outdo my sister. In the end, as far as she's told us, she just felt trapped by this guy. He didn't allow her to hang out with her friends and had her go to family events with people who hated her. He made her distance herself from us, which I think was painful for her because she missed out on quality time with her new nephews at the time. He basically controlled every part of her life. Anyway, she dumped him without ceremony on New Year's Eve and canceled the wedding right then and there. I don't think she even saw him again after that. She was always out when he came to get his things. Obviously, his family wasn't too happy about it and pestered her for months. She became depressed and needed medication, but it was my family that had to pay for the wedding expenses anyway. They were just glad to have their daughter back. Story 7. My boyfriend at the time had a female friend who, the night before her wedding, finally confessed to several friends, including him, that her fiancé had been mistreating her. She wasn't sure if she should go through with the marriage. We'd all noticed her becoming distant from us, but she would always deny that anything was wrong. The next day, her family took action to inform all the wedding guests about the situation. A group of her friends basically had their way into the guy's house to get all her belongings back, My boyfriend was a police officer, so he had a responsibility to take legal action against the guy. Although I was never completely clear on the details of what happened, the woman was angry with my boyfriend for a while because of this. However, a few years later, she's in a much happier relationship with someone I've known for a long time. She now understands that her friends and family are there for her and can help her when she needs it. Story 8. I have shared this story before in a somewhat similar post, but here it is again. I was engaged, so I was almost a bride. There were several final straws that led to the end of the relationship. A few of these happened before the engagement. First, he was living in his car when we started dating, which meant he wasn't financially stable. This happened just a couple of weeks into our relationship. Another issue was him wanting me to send him selfies all the time to prove where I was and what I was wearing. This was almost always my work clothes since I'm a server and wear a black long-sleeved shirt and pants. If I didn't text him back quickly enough, he would think I was with another man. About a month into the relationship, he demanded a key to my condo so he could see me whenever he wanted, not just when it was convenient for me. The biggest final straw came when he proposed. He got down on one knee and said, "I knew we were meant to be the moment we matched on Tinder. I love you so much. Now I can show everyone that I own you. Will you marry me?" I said no immediately and walked away. This happened just 3 months into the relationship. I'd never met his family, although I'd heard a lot about them. He'd only met my mother once, and that wasn't planned. After I said no to his proposal, he tried to get into my condo many times and kept calling me. Unfortunately, I had to change my phone number and get a restraining order against him. He was, and probably still is, crazy. Story 9. This story isn't about me, but about my mother. My mom canceled a wedding just a few weeks before the ceremony because she found out her fiancé had lied to her about where he was. He was actually partying at a hotel with friends and other women. She caught him in a hot tub at 1 a.m. with twin sisters. A few years later, she started dating and eventually married the man who is my biological father. It was especially awkward for her when she met his family and discovered that my father had 3 sisters, 2 of whom were the twins she had caught her ex-fiancé with in the hot tub. To clarify a few things, my mom and dad stayed together and got married after my mom had learned who his sisters were, so she did get over the fact that they were involved in the incident that ruined her first wedding. My mom and dad are divorced now and have been for many years. This has nothing to do with my dad's sisters or his family in general. They simply weren't compatible and argued a lot. It wasn't a big surprise that my dad wasn't the most faithful man either. I inherited my faithfulness in relationships from my mom, thankfully. Ooh, I bet that made Christmas dinners really awkward. Story 10. This story isn't mine, but it's about my best friend. Back in high school, I had a friend named Cheyenne. We were very close and loved planning our dream weddings. Every month when the new bridal magazine came out, we would spend our free period sitting on a bench with a pen, circling and talking excitedly about dresses. Fast forward to her junior year, and she met a guy named Nick. Nick was quite popular at our school, mainly because of his older sisters who were triplets and known as the triplets. She and Nick started dating after a few weeks. It wasn't a good relationship. They were constantly breaking up and getting back together, and it was no secret that he cheated on her every other weekend when she was away at her mom's house. After they graduated, they broke up for a short time, but got back together after 3 to 4 months. Halfway through her sophomore year of college, Cheyenne started acting very differently. She began drinking heavily, which led to an argument between us, and we didn't speak for a year. We reconnected when she found out she was pregnant with Nick's baby, and they were planning to get married. I was thrilled, and soon we were as close as we used to be. I was going to be her maid of honor, and they were going to have a beautiful wedding in the mountains. The day of the wedding, Cheyenne seemed nervous and strange. She insisted she was fine, but I kept an eye on her. 15 minutes before the ceremony was supposed to start, I ran outside quickly to see where Cheyenne was because she had stepped out and no one knew where she had gone. I found a pair of small heels by the road nearby. I left the shoes in case she planned to come back and went to tell the day of coordinator, or DOC. The ceremony was put on hold and we all started looking for Cheyenne. I saw Nick get really angry and heard him mutter, "That woman, I'm gonna get my hands on her." I didn't know what to do. I was worried about Cheyenne, thinking she might have fallen down or something, so you had people looking everywhere. I smelled something fishy and thought she might have run off, considering their past and what I had just heard Nick say. I drove into town, which was only a 10-minute drive, more like a 45-minute to 1-hour walk, and saw Cheyenne in her big white, fluffy dress, easy to spot, walking into a bar. I went in to talk to her, asking her what happened, and she confessed that Nick had been mistreating her since high school. Apparently that morning, he threatened to end her and her baby if she didn't behave. I called the police immediately, told the DOC to cancel everything, and drove her to the hospital. After a long, complicated trial and a restraining order, Nick was sent to prison, and Cheyenne moved to Portland to be close enough to her family but far enough away from him. Now she's getting remarried in September 2020, and her baby, now 4 years old and beautiful, is named Harmony. Story 11. I've waited a long time to share this story. Years ago, I was a single mom, working hard but not making much progress. I met a good guy type, an architect with a good sense of humor and all. We dated for about a year and then got engaged. But then something terrible happened. This is where I become the bad guy in many people's eyes. He was in a terrible car accident about 10 months before our wedding. He was also diabetic with poor control, which slowed his healing a lot. He ended up stuck in an electric wheelchair. And because his legs were in casts from hip to ankle, they had to be stretched out straight in front of him all the time. I really tried to support him, but he made it incredibly difficult. He complained about everything the doctors told him, refused physical therapy, took his medication wrong, didn't follow the wound care instructions, and didn't take his insulin properly. He did all the things that make for a terrible patient and an even worse person to be around. Throughout all this, our wedding plans were still going ahead, mostly being handled by his family. He was moved from the hospital to a live-in group home where his condition only got worse. Wearing pants was hard, so he went without anything in his lower half for months, just covering up with a bedsheet. His moods were unpredictable. One night he missed a question in Final Jeopardy and threw his whiz at me. Even after the doctor said he had to start bending his legs, he refused. Fast forward to my wedding day. The staff at the group home did everything they could to make the backyard look beautiful and special for everyone, and it really was lovely. Our families were there, seated, and the pianist was playing. My dad was by my side, ready to walk me down the aisle, but when he opened the door for us to start walking, there he was, with his legs straight out and hospital socks showing under a blanket. I froze. I told my dad I needed to go back inside the house. Once we were alone, I told my dad I couldn't go through with it, and I was sorry. My dad just smiled and said, "Thank God." He called my kids over, loaded us all into his car, and we drove away. We ended up moving to a different state, closer to my family, and we thrived. The groom went in and out of different facilities and never left the wheelchair. I know he was probably dealing with emotional and mental pain that I can't understand, but I also knew I couldn't raise my kids in that kind of environment. My first commitment was to them. I went on to finish my degree, and my kids are now adults. No one has thrown a whiz at me since. Well, yeah, at least you're whiz-free now. Anyways, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 12. I was almost the runaway bride, and I regret not making that decision. I dated my high school sweetheart for almost 2 years before the jealousy became too much to handle. I broke up with him a month after we graduated from high school, but we ended up at the same college and met again that fall. By October, I found out I was pregnant, and I was moved out of my Catholic home because of it. His parents let me stay with him, but we couldn't live in sin according to their beliefs, so we had to get married. I didn't want to go back to living in my car, so I agreed to the marriage. My parents managed to get back into my life before the wedding. On the day of the ceremony, as the music started playing and I stood up to walk down the aisle, my dad took my hand and said, "You know, you don't have to do this. You could come home with us." I was shocked. Why didn't he mention this an hour, a day, or a week before? I've always hated drama and didn't want to be that person who causes a scene, so I just said I couldn't back out and I went through with the marriage. My ex-husband was controlling, manipulative, and his behavior became more obvious after I got pregnant. It became even worse when we moved out of his parents' house a year later. I finally ran away when he almost hurt our babies. He instead did it to me because he found something in the carpet that I hadn't vacuumed properly. Yeah, I definitely should have chosen to be the runaway bride. Story 13. I wasn't a bride, but I did run away from a proposal. I was dating a guy who, looking back, was not the best, but at the time, I didn't realize it. I knew he was bipolar, which had been diagnosed, and he came from a very unstable family. I tried to be his support and help him get better, and sometimes things were okay. But other times it was just really difficult to deal with. He started talking about marriage about a year into a relationship. We had already broken up and gotten back together twice because of his tantrums and mood swings about how he felt about us. I just sort of went along with the talk of marriage because I did think I wanted to spend my life with him, but I wasn't ready to get married. I thought he was talking about a far-off future when we were more stable. A month later, he proposed. It wasn't a big event or anything, I just didn't see it coming. We were at his house, as usual. Oh, he lived with his parents. He was playing video games and I was watching TV on my laptop. He had ordered a pizza, and when it arrived, we sat down to eat. Then he took out a ring and proposed. I saw my whole future flash before my eyes. Getting married and being stuck with this person for the rest of my life. I froze. I knew I didn't want to say yes, but I was too scared to say no. He took my silence as a rejection and started yelling at me, calling me ungrateful and asking how I could refuse him. His parents came in and started yelling at me too for rejecting their son. I started crying, grabbed my purse, and ran out of the house. I didn't have my car, so I walked a block and called for an Uber. That poor Uber driver must have been shocked, picking up a girl on the side of the road, crying her eyes out. When I got home, I was shaking. Of course, he tried to call me over and over again, but I refused to talk to him for about 3 weeks. We eventually did talk, and I told him I didn't want to be with someone so unstable. I said he needed professional help and to get better before he could work in a relationship. He never did get help, and I haven't heard from him since. Story 14. We had only been together for 6 months when he proposed. We were both young and not even living together. My instincts told me right away that it was too soon, but I said yes anyway because I thought he loved me and I loved him. I truly believed we could build a good life together. I made it clear that I wanted to wait before he got married, but he was eager to move things along as quickly as possible. I didn't even want to tell our families about the engagement because I knew they would be upset that we were so young and had only been together for a few months. As time went on, I continued to say that I wasn't ready to get married at my age and wanted to spend more time with him before we took that step. He didn't take it well and accused me of cheating on him, thinking there was no other reason I would want to wait. Things became very bad, and I eventually left him for good. I returned the engagement ring and we parted ways civilly, but he wasn't ready to let go easily. He called and texted me constantly for weeks, accusing me of being obsessed with him and following him around. I started to realize he wasn't thinking clearly, and it was scary. Thankfully, it calmed down after a while and things began to return to normal. Unfortunately, he started spreading awful rumors about me, claiming I had accused him of crimes. His whole family turned against me because of these lies, and it was tough since we shared many of the same friends. He damaged my reputation and my self-esteem, but it made me realize I had avoided a disaster by not marrying him. Every now and then he messages me on social media, wanting to get back together. I either don't respond or give him a polite but very firm no. This isn't really important, but it's another interesting detail. He gave my engagement ring to his mother as a Mother's Day gift, and now she wears it all the time. She must know it used to be mine, but she still sees it as a sweet gift from her troubled son. Story 15. When I was in high school, I worked at Chess King in the mall. A man came in who was very taken with me. He had lied about his age at first, saying he was 20, but I soon found out he was actually 26. I had some issues with my dad, loved the attention, and quickly thought I was in love. He asked me to marry him just 2 weeks later. He'd even asked my parents for permission, and they said yes, which still upsets me. Summer was coming up, and he wanted me to move in with him for the summer. I was living in New York at the time, and he lived in Maryland. He had been in New York visiting his parents and staying with them until his new job started as a used car salesman. So, I got into his white pickup truck and we drove to Maryland for the summer. When we arrived, it was a tiny apartment in an all-black neighborhood. We're both white. He had rented the apartment over the phone and had no idea what the neighborhood was like beforehand. This was before the internet. He took his truck to work every day, leaving me without transportation, so I would just walk around during the day. Everyone would stare at me. No one actually talked to me. I felt extremely out of place, even though I tried my best to be okay with the situation. He wanted to be intimate every day the moment he got home from work and expected me to be waiting for him in the bedroom. I hated it. I would close my eyes until it was over. After 5 days while he was at work, I opened the silverware drawer in the apartment and a big roach crawled across the utensils. I'm not sure why that was the turning point for me, but I just said out loud, I don't care anymore. I packed my suitcase and sat on the couch with it on my lap until he got home from work. The second I saw him, I said, "Take me home." He said a lot of things. Was angry, but I didn't say anything besides that I wanted to go home. Somehow he agreed to drive me back to New York, and we left that night. The whole way home, he talked about how this didn't change anything and that we would still be together. I stayed silent. When we pulled into the driveway, I took off the ring and placed it on the console. I didn't say anything and quickly went into the house, locking the door behind me. He didn't come after me, but kept calling constantly for weeks. I refused to answer. I never saw him again. I'm 41 now and have 4 children. Only as an adult have I been able to see how disturbing and frightening what I went through was. For years, I was embarrassed to tell that story, but now I realize I was a child and that it's him and my parents who should be embarrassed. Story 16. I wasn't a runaway bride, but I was hired to work at a wedding as a florist many years ago. The bride and groom had agreed to every contract and we were all set to get married. The bride was on tour until 2 weeks before the wedding date. She's in the theater, so I mostly talked through email. The groom would come by to make payments and drop off things for the wedding. He was always pretty relaxed, which isn't something you see often with the grooms. But it turned out he was cheating on the bride with their own sister and also with a best man's girlfriend, who was part of their friend group. The bride found out just before her bachelorette party and called off the wedding. I felt terrible that we couldn't refund any payments because we had already placed bulk orders for flowers, but we offered her credit for another event. We ended up becoming friends on Facebook. She's getting married to someone else now and seems much happier. Story 17. This story isn't about me, but about my cousin who was supposed to marry a girl. She fell deeply in love with another guy she met just 2 days before the wedding and left my cousin. It wasn't at the altar, but it was very close to the wedding day. I was young at the time and was supposed to be the flower girl. My brothers were the ushers. We lived about 6 hours away, and I remember being very confused during the ride home and wondering why I didn't get to be a flower girl, while everyone else was completely silent. In a surprising twist of fate, the guy she fell in love with is now a professor at the same university where my brother works. His office is just down the hall from my brother's. He and the bride have been married for almost 20 years now. Meanwhile, my cousin has been married 3 times, has been arrested for DUI so many times that I don't think he can even get a driver's license. And he has gained a lot of weight, up to about 300 pounds. I think the girl made the right choice in choosing the other guy. Story 18. I know someone who had to spend money on flights to a location twice because the bride ran away from the groom. The first time she left right before the rehearsal period was about to start. The second time, she ran away at the altar. You might think the guy would have understood the message after the first time, but it was a situation where a rich but not very attractive man had managed to be with a supermodel. Because he was afraid of losing her, he tried to hat her into commitment by being emotionally manipulative, not through actual coercion. Feeling guilty, she was convinced twice to almost go through with the wedding. From the pictures my friend showed me of the couple, I can honestly say that the groom was reaching far beyond what anyone else would have. I can understand why you didn't want to lose her, but I can't support manipulating someone into pretending to love you. Nor can I agree with him deluding himself into thinking it could work after the first failed wedding. At that point, you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. Maybe he didn't realize that there were young singles in his area just waiting to meet him. Story 19. Not me, but my friend's wedding. He was getting married to a stunning girl, a real 10 out of 10. She was beautiful, had an amazing figure, and looked incredible in her wedding dress. We were all happy for him because while he wasn't the best looking guy, he was very talented. He could garden, craft, design, and build. He even designed a watering system for his home garden. When he finished it, he was proud, but we all just asked, "Couldn't you just use a sprinkler?" He laughed and said, "Yeah, but I made this." The wedding day started normally. We all met up, chatted, and talked to the girl's family, who were odd. They weren't weird in a cultish way, more like they seemed uncomfortable and just wanted to get the wedding over with. The ceremony began with the usual rituals. The flower girls walked down the aisle, the bride followed, and everything was going as planned until right before the vows. That's when our friend suddenly ran out of a nearby door, leaving the bride standing there. Then, unbelievably, the bride, her father, and her mother pulled out weapons and chased after him, trying to catch him, I guess, but he had already gone too far away, and none of their weapons got him. The bride's father ended up in jail, her mother passed away of a heart emergency a year or so later, and the bride has become a small influencer with a new guy in her life. The reason our friend ran was because the bride was extremely emotionally hurtful. She made him keep a chart of his whereabouts, who he was talking to, how much money he had, when he'd be back, and what he was doing. She wouldn't let him sleep in the same room as her and would hurt him awake if she found him sleeping on the couch. In their 3 years together, they only had been intimate twice, and he said she was terrible in bed, just lying there like a dead fish. She also never took any responsibility for her life. Her parents bought her a house, a car, and other things. She crashed the car and she got bored of it, tried to end his cat multiple times, and her puppy mysteriously disappeared one day. She was just crazy. Story 20. I was the groom, and I left just moments after the ceremony ended. My ex-partner was mentally unstable. When we started dating, she was on several psychiatric medications that she didn't tell me about. We moved in together and she stopped taking them suddenly, which made my life very difficult. She was constantly crazy. She would go out without letting me know, ignore my calls, and then come back and yell at me for watching a movie with an attractive actress, calling the actress names. In her eyes, every woman was distasteful, and she wouldn't let me leave the house except for work, but she would show up randomly at my job to check on me, making sure I wasn't cheating. She didn't work, and I had a good office job. Thankfully, my manager felt sorry for me. Why did I stay? I wasn't in a good mental state myself. I had a very bad childhood, so I was used to enduring her behavior. Eventually, I agreed to marry her. We planned the wedding and reception, had the ceremony, and everyone thought we were married. But I had a moment of clarity and refused to sign the marriage certificate until she went to counseling and took her medications again. She refused, so I put the certificate away, thinking that was the end of it. I started going to counseling secretly and got my life together. I moved my money into an account she didn't know about. She kept cheating. I kept going to counseling and moving my assets. And then I just disappeared from her life. 4 years later, I was with a new woman and ready to propose. I had the ring and received an email from my ex. She told me we were actually married and wanted a divorce because she had met someone new and wanted to get married again. I was shocked. What had happened was that she couldn't accept being told no. She took my wallet, found a friend who looked like me, and went to the courthouse to file the marriage certificate a week after I had said no. So legally, we were married, and I hadn't known. I was furious, but also relieved she told me before I proposed to my girlfriend. My girlfriend was very understanding and stayed with me while I dealt with my ex. I talked to lawyers about what I could do, but they said there was no proof, so there was nothing to be done. The good news was that she just wanted the divorce and nothing else. The bad news was that her current fiancé broke up with her, and she dragged her feet in the divorce. Luckily, it was all taken care of. She still tries to contact me occasionally, but I ignore her. Now I'm still married to the woman who stayed with me through everything. We're very happy together and have 2 children. Story 21. I've been engaged 4 or 5 times, but only married once. That's important because it sets the stage for these 2 stories. In 2007, the second guy proposed. We met when I was a freshman in college. After a whirlwind romance that lasted just 2 weeks, we impulsively decided to get married one morning. It seemed spontaneous and romantic, right? But young me wasn't making the best decisions. We made it to the courthouse in my small hometown, only to find it closed for renovations that day. We were disappointed, but I quickly realized it was probably for the best. Why rush into marriage? That night he called me, saying he had taken some pills and was trying to end it all. I talked him down and stayed up all night working things out and doing some soul searching. I realized I wasn't ready for marriage, and he had issues he needed to address. I wasn't mentally mature or experienced enough to handle them properly. When I tried to break up with him later, he threatened to end it all again, and I told him I would help as a friend, but not as a significant other. It's been about 12 years and he's much healthier and happier now. He's stable and doing well for himself, and I'm proud to see him thriving. From 2010 to 2012, the fourth guy proposed. It was a long-distance relationship. He was exceptionally handsome, well-educated, lived and worked abroad, came from an upper-class family, and had me wrapped around his finger. We had been together for a year and a half, traveling between the US, UK, Denmark, and Germany. I wanted to get married, but he didn't until I was about to leave him. He didn't want a monogamous relationship like I did and suggested we could be one of those modern married couples that still meet with other people. He constantly called me names, used intimacy against me psychologically, didn't want me to work because women in his family didn't, and insisted I give up my US citizenship and drop out of college to move overseas with him. There were many other issues too. One night before I was due to fly home, an elderly cab driver asked me, "If he will make a real commitment to you, why are you wasting your time here in Newcastle, England, with him instead of finding someone who makes you feel whole?" I tried to make excuses, but he wasn't having it. Later that night, the last straw was when he left me crying in pain in the bathtub from the illness he gave me to go do stuff with his neighbor for business. As I left for the airport the next morning, I looked at him from the cab and thought, this is going to be the last time I ever see him in person. I reflected on the conversation with the cab driver and essentially ghosted him when I got back to the States. I met my now husband 2 months later, and we married in 2015. My ex stalked me from 2012 to 2018. I've only ever told my husband and best friend how bad it got with him, and even though we've been together almost 7 years, I still struggle with it sometimes, especially if my husband gets upset with me, which rarely happens. He's a great guy, sweet, funny, respectful, and patient. Story 22. I was a dancer, mostly doing ballet with some appearances in trade shows and a small role on Broadway, though that didn't last long. Anyway, I met this guy, and even though he was a bit slow, I fell for him. We were all set to get married. His dad was the local sheriff, so he took care of all the arrangements for us. It was the day of the wedding, and I was literally at the altar when I got cold feet, so I took off in my wedding dress. My car broke down, but this guy named Bo was kind enough to stop and pick me up. Everyone called him Bo. Now, remember, my future father-in-law was the sheriff. He didn't take kindly to me running away and was on my tail, eventually learning that I was picked up by Bo. He started chasing Bo. It turned out that Bo and his friend, the Snowman, were running shady business across state lines, so naturally they got worried about being followed by a cop. The chase crossed several states, with other agencies trying and failing to stop us. Near Bo's home, it got really bad, but we narrowly escaped capture throughout the chase the sheriff kept on us. I fell in love with Bo, and things were good for a while, but he started drinking too much and I left him. Not knowing where to turn, I went back to my fiancée. We worked out our problems and set a new date to get married. Again, the sheriff got the town all set up and it was the wedding day. I was in the church when I received a phone call. It was Bo's friend, the Snowman. Beau was in a really bad place and they had a chance to make some big money and get their lives back together. However, he needed my help to get Beau. So I left my wedding again and started on a new adventure. Though this time it wasn't cores we were transporting, it was an elephant. But that's a story for another time. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.